Never before in history, America's inspired birth. Page 116 through 124. Thomas Jefferson described Samuel Adams as the fountain of American independence. Why? In 1736, a 14-year-old Adams entered Harvard to become a Puritan clergyman. In 1743, at the age of 21, he stood before the royal governor of Massachusetts and argued that it is within a Christian's right to register the will of a king when necessary for the good of the people. In his argument, he drew on the Protestant resistance theories of Calvin, Beza, Ponet, the Vindicate, Rutherford, Knox, Milton, and Locke. See chapters 1 and 2. From that time forward, Adams dedicated himself to politics, law, and patriotism. Nonetheless, he always remained a Puritan. While at Harvard, Adams befriended a younger fellow student named James Otis. The two, along with a future Harvard graduate named John Hancock, helped instigate the American Revolution. Together they organized a band of agitators known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty challenged the British Crown's right to tax or impose religious standards on the colonies. For Adams, these were two sides of the same coin. He knew the religious sentiments of his fellow Americans, and he knew how to arouse their passions. He therefore made the early settlers' quest for liberty the essence of the conflict. According to Adams, the danger the colonists faced was the utter loss of those religious rights, the enjoyment of which our good forefathers had more especially in their intention when they explored and settled the New World. In March of 1770, a group of youth in Boston badgered a British officer in the town square by throwing snowballs at him. Several other officers came to his aid, and a brawl ensued. A British officer named Kilroy shot and killed the American named Sam Gray. Crispus Attucks, an African American, was also shot, and by the end of the conflict 5 Americans fell victim to the British muskets. Samuel Adams called the event a massacre. One of his fellow agitators, Paul Revere, quickly manufactured a printed illustration of the incident and circulated numerous copies of it throughout Boston. Propaganda like this kept the revolutionary fires stoked. When Parliament later imposed a tax on tea, Adams again rallied his followers. He called a meeting at the Old South Church in Boston, organized an act of civil disobedience. The plan was to board a ship in the Boston harbor that contained a cargo of East India tea and dispose of it. Adams made it clear that innocent civilians were not to be harmed. The meeting was then dismissed, and thousands of citizens followed Adams and his band down to the wharf. About 50 men, colored with face paint of native warriors and wielding hatchets, embarked upon the ship, while thousands looked on. Adams declared that this act would save the country. It certainly ensured further clashes with the British. Although Jefferson was drawing on Locke when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson was also drawing on Samuel Adams. Adams popularized Locke's political principles and made them America's own. In 1772, Adams delivered an address titled The Rights of the Colonists. He wrote, "Among the natural rights of the colonists were these: first, a right of life; second, liberty; and third, to property, and in the case of intolerable oppression, civil or religious, to leave the society they belong to, and enter into another. When men enter into society, it is by voluntary consent." According to Adams, these principles derive from the first law of nature. Moreover, the right to freedom, being the gift of God Almighty, it is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave. The entire political theory of the Declaration was that in Adams' 1772 document, but unlike Jefferson, who was a Unitarian, Adams was a Bible-believing Puritan. Samuel Adams was far more than a Harvard theologian or a Lockean philosopher. He was one of the shrewdest political figures in American history. If not for Samuel Adams in the North and Patrick Henry in the South, the United States may never have been united. In earlier colonial days, New Englanders had little respect for Virginians and vice versa. They had very different worldviews, particularly in the understanding of Christianity and their way of life. Citizens of New England were primarily subsistence farmers, merchants, or craftsmen. They also approved of Cromwell and the Puritans who beheaded Charles I Stuart. In the South, the economy revolved around cash crops, tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. The people tended to support the British monarchy and ally themselves with the Stuart kings. Both Charleston and Carolina had been named for Charles II Stuart, and the affection he shared with the Virginians led him to designate the colony his Old Dominion. Slavery in the South troubled the Northern Puritans, led them to disassociate themselves with the South as much as possible. Likewise, Southerners tended to view the New Englanders as an uncultivated working class of stodgy do-gooders whose rigid Calvinism deceived them into thinking that they were God's chosen people. Although the Great Awakening had been an intercolonial event that erased the provincialism of the colonies, sharp disagreements between North and South remained until the time of Samuel Adams. Adams initiated committees of correspondence to promote cooperation among the colonies in dealing with the British Crown. These committees evolved into the Continental Congress, an assembly that produced the Declaration of Independence. When the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, the Virginians were cautious about cooperating with radical Protestants. From New England, likewise, many Northern Presbyterians saw the Southern Anglicans as enemies. Left unchecked, these tensions could have disrupted the First Continental Congress and ultimately prevented the formation of the United States. To ease the tension, Samuel Adams, a Puritan, motioned that a Southern minister and Anglican invoke God's blessing on the assembly. This was very shrewd. Later John Adams would write, "I must confess, I never heard a better prayer, or one so well pronounced, done with such fervor, such ardor, such correctness and pathos, and in language so eloquent and sublime for Congress for the province of Massachusetts Bay, especially the town of Boston. It had an excellent effect upon everybody here. The whole scene and crisis was enough to melt a heart of stone. I saw the tears gush into the eyes of the old, grave Pacific Quakers." This gesture was returned when Patrick Henry, during his "Give me liberty or give me death" oration in Richmond, Virginia, called the Puritans "our brethren," who are already in the battlefield. Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry inspired their respective regions of America to join forces with the other. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were at the home of their pastor, the Reverend Jonas Clark, in Lexington, Massachusetts, on the evening of April 18, 1775. When Paul Revere arrived with the news that General Gage's troops were approaching. When the first shots were fired on April 19th of 1775, Adams exclaimed, "Oh, what a glorious morning this is." 5 days before the next major battle at the Bunker Hill, the British military offered a pardon to all Americans who would lay down their arms and retire. There were only two exceptions, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The offer did not extend to them. As leaders of the Sons of Liberty, they were unforgivable. In August of 1775, the King of England proclaimed that the colonies were engaged in open and avowed rebellion, and were thus outside the protection of his government or laws. Shortly thereafter, Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act, which declared that all American ships and their cargoes were forfeit to the British Crown. In order to solidify Southern support for the war, John Adams urged that the Continental Congress employ a Virginian to lead the Continental forces. The Congress agreed. General George Washington assumed command of the Continental forces in Boston. On New Year's Day of 1776, the King leveled Norfolk, Virginia, with naval artillery, and in May 1776, the colonists learned that the King had signed treaties with German states to obtain mercenary soldiers to invade the colonies. The King had not only refused to protect the rights of the colonists, but he was now poised for war. The Revolution of 1776, according to the celebrated historian George Bancroft, was a Presbyterian measure. It was the natural outgrowth of the principles which the Presbyterianism of Old World planted in her sons. What did Bancroft mean? Those who lived through the American Revolution saw it as a continuation of the 17th century Protestant Revolution in England, i.e., the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. In describing the American Revolution of 1776, William Jonas told King George III, "This has been a Presbyterian war from the beginning, as certainly as in 1641. Another supporter of King George wrote, "I fix all the blame on these extraordinary proceedings upon the Presbyterians. They have been the chief and principal instruments in all these flaming measures." The royal governor of Georgia wrote that the revolution was based upon Oliverian principles, referring to Oliver Cromwell. Several other voices loyal to the king were quick to trace the American endeavor to the politics of the Puritans and the Presbyterians of the 17th century. The historian Edmund Morgan reported that royal officials in the colonies complained that the Presbyterians are as averse to kings as they were in the days of Cromwell. and some began to cry out, "No king, but King Jesus." Thomas Jefferson adopted as his own motto the cry of the Puritans during the English Civil War: "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." A Hessian captain fighting on behalf of the British during the American Revolution told a friend in Germany, "Call this war, dearest friend, by whatsoever name you may. Only call it not an American Revolution. It is nothing more or less than an Irish-Scotch Presbyterian rebellion." It was not only the opponents of colonial independence who identified the American cause with Presbyterian rebellion. The colonists themselves were fond of that link. Just as we have our national heroes, Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, so did the early American colonists. Their three favorites were Oliver Cromwell, John Hampden, and Algernon Sidney. All three were Puritan leaders associated with 17th century rebellions in England. Samuel Adams enjoyed being called a Roundhead. The Sons of Liberty referred to Cromwell as a glorious fellow, and yearned for a new Cromwell to espouse their cause. Editorials criticizing the British government in several colonial newspapers were signed with the pseudonym Oliver Cromwell. In 1774, a Connecticut clergyman described the English Civil War as the good old days. England was never more happy before, nor much more since, than after the head of the 5 Stuart was severed from his body and while it was under the protectorship of Oliver Cromwell. A tavern in Boston was named Cromwell's Head. The sign outside, which featured a likeness of Cromwell, was just high enough to pass under it. If one ducked a few inches apparently, those who entered were supposed to bow to Cromwell's image. As for the colonists, who took up arms during the Revolution, the majority were Presbyterians. They understood their struggle as a continuation of the 17th century Protestant Revolution in England. As Page Smith notes, the Protestant Reformation produced a new kind of consciousness and a new kind of man. The English colonies in America, in turn, produced a new and unique strain of consciousness. It is impossible to understand the intellectual, moral forces behind the American Revolution without understanding the role that Protestant Christianity played in shaping the ideals, principles, and institutions of colonial America. The right of resistance to unlawful authority, so clearly enunciated by the parliamentary leaders of the English Civil War, and confirmed by the Glorious Revolution of 1689, was the basis on which the Americans opposed the unlimited authority of Parliament over the British colonies. Page 122, Samuel Adams Committee of Correspondence. Declares the rights of the colonists, November 1772, natural rights of the colonists as men. Among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, a right to life, liberty; second, to liberty; and third, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. These are evident branches of rather than deductions from the duty of self-preservation commonly called the first law of nature. All men have a right to remain in the state of nature as long as they please, and in case of intolerable oppression, civil or religious, to leave the society they belong to and enter into another. When men enter into a society, it is by voluntary consent, and they have a right to demand and insist upon the performance of such conditions and previous limitations as form an equitable original compact. Every natural right not expressly given up or, from the nature of social compact, necessarily ceded remains. All positive and civil laws should conform, as far as possible, to the law of natural reason and equity. As neither reason requires nor religion permits the contrary, every man living in or out of state of civil society has a right peaceably and quietly to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Just and true liberty, equal, impartial liberty, in matters spiritual and temporal, is a thing that all men are entitled to by the eternal and immutable laws of God and nature, as well as by the laws of nations and well-grounded municipal laws, which much have their foundation in the former. In regard to religion, mutual toleration in the different professions, therefore, in what good and candid minds in all ages have ever practiced, and both by precept and example, inculcated on mankind, and in the general agree among Christians, that this spirit of toleration in the fullest extent consists with the being of civil society, is the chief characteristic mark of the Church, insomuch that Mr. Locke has asserted and approved, beyond the possibility of contradiction on any solid ground, that such toleration ought to be extended to all those doctrines are not subversive of society. The right to freedom, being the gift of God Almighty, It is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave. The rights of the colonists as Christians. These may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the Institutes of the Greater Lawgiver, the head of the Christian Church, which are found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament. By the Act of the British Parliament, commonly called the Toleration Act, every subject in England, not seeking to overthrow society, was restored to and re-established in his natural right to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. And by the charter of this province, it is granted, ordained, and established, that is, declared as an original right, that there shall be liberty of conscience allowed in the worship of God to all Christians, except those seeking to overthrow society, inhabiting or which shall inhabit or be resident within such province or territory. Magna Carta itself is a substance that but a constrained declaration or proclamation and promulgation in the name of the kings, lords, and commons of the sense of commoners had of their original inherent indefeasible natural rights as those of free citizens equally predurable with the other. That great author, the great jurist, and even that court writer, Mr. Justice Blackstone, holds that this recognition was justly ordained of King John, sword in hand. And pre-adventure, it must be one day, sword in hand, again rescued and preserved from total destruction and oblivion. The rights of the colonists as subjects. All persons born in the British American colonies are, by the laws of God and nature and by common law of England, well entitled, and by acts of the British Parliament declared to be entitled, to all the natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights, liberties, and privileges of subjects born in Great Britain or the realm. The legislative has no right to absolute arbitrary power over the lives and fortunes of the people, nor can mortals assume a prerogative not only too high for men, but for angels, and therefore reserved for the exercise of the deity alone.